ITBP's extra high-tech proposal for LAWS, radars, LAWROS set to be okayed. The centre is all set to approve the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, ITBP, proposal for acquiring unmanned aerial vehicles, LAWS, advanced long-range reconnaissance and observation systems, LAWROS, radars, all-terrain vehicles and snow scooters for the newly sanctioned border outposts, BOPs, along the border with China. ITBP is responsible for guarding the 3,488 km long LAC with China, which runs along Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, and Himachal Pradesh. The acquisition is part of the extensive revamp of surveillance equipment and gadgets for the Central Force amid the standoff between India and China in Pangong Tso, Galwan Valley, Gogra and Depsang Plains, said officials. ITBP has sought deployment of more high-tech surveillance cameras that can see 25 to 30 kilometers inside the Chinese territory. At high altitude, drones have been useful in monitoring activities of Chinese forces, said a senior government official, who did not wish to be identified. LAWROS is a sensor system which provides long-range daytime and nighttime surveillance. It can detect and track human as well as vehicular movements during day and night as well as bad weather. At present, there are 180 BOPs operational along the LAC, with each outpost having about 100 soldiers. In January, the Union Home Ministry gave the go-ahead for creation of 47 additional ITBP BOPs and 12 staging camps. Among the 47 BOPs, 34 have been planned in Arunachal Pradesh, where the terrain is extremely inhospitable, while 5 will come up in the Western Theatre. The staging camps are being set up to act as temporary BOPs for ITBP Jawans out on patrol along the Himalayan frontier, and provide them rations, logistics and a place to stay. The border guarding force had sought creation of staging camps to reduce the inter-BOP distance at the arduous border, which experiences frequent blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, said a Home Ministry official. The new BOPs will be temperature-controlled and will help forces to counter transgressions by the Chinese army. They will also help the border guarding force to better rotate troops from forward locations to units in the mainland. Currently, the troops are rotated every 3 months, the Chinese army flops in India. What will Xi do next? Ruler Xi Jinping, already roiling the Communist Party with a rectification campaign and mass persecution of foes, has risked his future with recent high-profile incursions into Indian-controlled territory. Unfortunately for Xi, he is the architect of these aggressive moves into India, and his People's Liberation Army, PLA, has unexpectedly flopped. The Chinese army's failures on the Indian border will have consequences. As an initial matter, they give Xi an excuse to pick up the pace of replacing adversaries in the armed forces with loyal elements. Heads, therefore, will roll. More important, the failures motivate China's aggressive ruler, who as chairman of the party's Central Military Commission, is the leader of the PLA, to launch another offensive against Indian positions. Beginning in early May, Chinese forces advanced south of the line of actual control, the temporary border between the two giants, principally in 3 separate areas in Ladakh, high in the Himalayas. The boundary is not well defined, and for years Chinese troops trespassed into Indian-controlled territory, especially after Xi became party general secretary in November 2012. The May incursions took New Delhi by surprise. As Cleo Pascal of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies tells Newsweek, Moscow in April had assured India that large-scale Chinese maneuvers in its Tibet Autonomous Region were not preparations for a move below the line. China also took India by surprise on June 15 in the Galwan Valley, the northernmost of the 3 areas of incursion. In a premeditated move, Chinese troops killed 20 Indian soldiers. It was the first deadly confrontation between the two giants in 45 years. Beijing is accustomed to getting its way in disputed territory, especially because Indian leaders and soldiers, psychologically paralyzed by their loss in the 1962 border war with China, played only defense. Paralyzed no more. China is thought to have suffered at least 43 deaths in the Galwan clash. Pascal says the number of Chinese killed could exceed 60. Indian troops fought back ferociously. Beijing won't admit the extent of the debacle. Then, beginning late last month, for the first time in a half-century, India carried out an offensive against China, taking back high ground the Chinese recently grabbed. China's forces were surprised when Indian troops mounted their attempt to retake strategic high points. Stunned Chinese soldiers retreated. China's subsequent efforts to counter the Indian moves proved ineffective. At least for the moment, India's troops, in the southernmost of the three areas of conflict, are in control of territory once in Chinese hands. Can the dragon fight? The ground force of the People's Liberation Army can move against undefended targets, as a series of incursions south of the line of actual control demonstrate, but it is not clear how effective it is in battle. The ground force does not have a track record of success in contested situations. Its last major engagement was in 1979 when, in the effort to teach Vietnam a lesson, the Chinese launched what they called a defensive counterattack into Vietnamese territory and, in the process, were repelled and humiliated by their much smaller neighbor. Now, after decades of an unprecedented modernization effort, the ground force is far better equipped and trained, but it is apparently not much more effective on the battlefield. India is not giving the invaders the opportunity to improve. Both sides have just accused the other of violating decades-old rules of engagement by firing warning shots. It appears, however, the Chinese are the ones closer to the truth. India's troops are displaying newfound boldness. India has effectively ditched these rules intended to limit casualties. The game has changed, Pascal told me. You can say the Indians are more aggressive or more aggressively defensive, but they are in fact bolder and better. We are going to learn more about Chinese capabilities soon. The setback in the Himalayas poses problems for Xi, which means it poses a problem for everyone else. Jaydev Ranade, a former senior Indian intelligence official and now head of the New Delhi-based Center for China Analysis and Strategy, said Xi needs a victory and could force further conflict in Ladakh. In that conflict, the Chinese, Richard Fisher of the Virginia-based International Assessment and Strategy Center tells Newsweek, could roll out joint mechanized warfare for which they have been preparing for 30 years. Given the rapid build-up of Indian forces and their high state of readiness, Xi is not assured of the success that Ranade believes he craves and needs, especially because India's army has brought mechanized vehicles of its own to Ladakh. In China's highly politicized system, the setbacks in Ladakh cannot be perceived as Xi's fault, so he will almost surely purge elements of the military. PLA leaders begin to see little choice but to undertake offensive military actions to avoid becoming a victim of Xi's internal terror, Fisher says. What we are learning in 2020, Fisher notes, is that Xi wants victories, and as the PLA is judged to have reached requisite levels of strength by rearming and reorganization, Xi is increasingly willing to use the military. China's leader has shown he is good at political mobilization of the army and that he can spend large sums on military equipment. He has also perfected the art of intimidating other countries. Xi Jinping, however, has yet to show his military, in a fight, is worth a damn. Other nations will take notice that China's military is deficient. Why is the PLA less than the sum of its parts? It can be excessive political control of army operations, a problem in all communist militaries, or something else. Yet the failure to push around the Indian military means Xi's ability to intimidate anyone is much reduced. Unfortunately, it looks like China's leader, who had looked invincible, now has something to prove. As a result, he appears absolutely determined to make his point by launching another attempt to break India's strong stand against China. India's strong and sustained response to China's aggressiveness and refusal to stand down on its eastern borders despite facing tough domestic situations, has elicited praise from diplomats posted in India who feel that this confrontation, which is in its 5th month, has enhanced greatly India's image as a strong country. Multiple diplomats, who spoke to the Sunday Guardian, off the record, stated that till now, India had only confronted Pakistan, which is militarily and economically a weaker country. However, by taking the Chinese head-on and occupying key positions at the borders, which were earlier not under their control, Indian strategists have proved their mettle, diplomatically and militarily. According to a political officer with an Asia-Pacific country, which is engaged in a love-hate relationship with China, His initial assessment that he had shared with his headquarters was that India will have to back down if the confrontation stretches. The diplomat further stated that following the Galwan incident, where 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives, their reading was that India will start looking for reasons to de-escalate the tension in view of the aggressive posture that China had adopted. India's decision to match every move the Chinese are making has come as a surprise. The assessment of our intelligence wing, too, was that India will take a few steps back if the situation is not resolved by June end. Clearly, the assessment has not matched what has actually happened on the ground. We see this event as a very significant one as China's attempt to turn Asia into its territory has been stopped. India's strategic image has moved up several notches due to the way it has handled China, the diplomat told the Sunday Guardian. Another defense attaché with the European country, who has been closely following the developments taking place at India's eastern borders, said that the banning of Chinese apps by India may not hurt China economically very much, but it had hurt its pride and will encourage other countries to take similar steps in the near future. China believes in pushing ahead like a battering ram. India, which till now was passively resisting this ram, is now actively and very loudly derailing it. Strategists in China, from what we have gathered, were not hoping that India would respond the way it did, the attached said while referring to the military action taken by the Indian Army on the 30th of August, as a result of which it is now occupying key positions. The fact that India, for the first time, has decided to show the Chinese that men of Tibetan origin, that constitute the Special Frontier Force, SSF, were used in the recent military activities, too, has come as surprising pleasant development for the attaché quoted above. India has given a very strong message to China by deploying the SSF and telling the world that it has used the SSF in the recent confrontation. It is China which now needs to think twice before stretching and turning this into a bigger confrontation. India has deployed as many men and machines that China has on its border, and that too without being apologetic
Modi
about
can
it.
repeat
1971 and ensure a 1962 in reverse. The difference an alliance makes to outcomes is clear from a readout of the 1962 conflict with China and the 1971 ending of the Pakistan Army genocide in Bangladesh. From 1947 onwards, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru focused obsessively on foreign policy, molding it to his liking. India becoming the leader of the non-aligned movement was regarded by Nehru as a historic achievement. 15 years later, Marshal Lin Biao got the nod from Chairman Mao and ordered PLA soldiers to pour across the Tibetan border with India. There was no non-aligned country willing to come out in support of India and against China during the conflict. Even countries that had been courted avidly by the Prime Minister, such as Yugoslavia, Egypt, and Sri Lanka, avoided giving offense to the People's Republic of China. As for the US and the USSR, the only countries that could have made a difference in a conflict involving China, the first intervened too late and too insubstantially to alter the outcome, while Moscow adopted the same stance as is being taken by that capital now, which was to avoid taking sides while giving signals of friendship separately to both sides. Not just Congress, but BJP governments have protected the mistakes made in the past from entering the public domain, and even secretive Beijing has released more documents about past policies than has New Delhi. There has, therefore, been little discussion of the frantic cries for help from the leader of the non-aligned movement to the US once Chinese troops began crossing across the border in multiple points and in strength. General P.N. Thapar and Lieutenant Gen. B. M. Kaul had fashioned their military strategies on the border on the basis that anything other than dribbles and feints by the PLA was out of the question. Prime Minister Nehru and Defence Minister Krishna Menon took that assumption as an article of faith, exactly as Marshal Stalin had in 1941 when reports began to pour in that the German army was about to launch a blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union. At the precise moment when Hitler's troops crossed into the USSR in force at 3 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, they came across a train loaded with grain from the USSR that was making its way on a bridge across the Bug River. The train was chugging on its way to Germany even as troops from that country had launched an invasion of the USSR. Fast forward to October 1962 and the refusal of key policymakers to understand what was soon coming India's way across the border with China. despite more than a decade of incessant intrusions, and since the 1959 relocation of the Dalai Lama to India, increasingly bad-tempered commentary on the world's most populous democracy from the world's most populous authoritarian state. As in those days, in 2020 as well, voices abound who believe that the next summit meeting, the next telephone call, the next expertly drafted statement, will result in the Sino-Indian border situation moving away from the shadow of impending conflict. Weak India is China's AIM. Not that accurate information has been lacking, and not merely to those in the inner recesses of the government of India but to those much lower down the food chain, including private citizens. On the 13th of April 2020, even this analyst got to know of PLA troops concentrating across the line of actual control. Subsequently, information reached that the number of soldiers had increased sharply, and had reached the levels needed for a major offensive. On the 5th of May, this analyst was informed by sources of established credibility in a distant location that PLA troops massed across the boundary line had entered Indian territory and were moving at speed across terrain that was being guarded not by the military but by paramilitary formations. What ought to have happened on the 13th of April took place on the 13th of May, which was the entry into the theatre of the military, and a consequent halt to the onward progress of the other side. Subsequently, multiple conversations, including at the elevated level of the special representatives of the two countries, took place, and it seems to have been assumed by some policymakers in India that the Chinese side had decided to call it a day as a consequence of such conversations. Soon after this comforting thought, the Galwan clashes took place. Now the Moscow talks between the Chinese and Indian foreign and defense ministers have been taken as an indication that this situation has at last been diffused. This is unlikely. From the start of his taking over as Chinese Communist Party General Secretary in 2012, Xi Jinping has been taking an assertive stance on PRC claims, adding new ones to the many already enumerated in the past. It is not possible to believe that the movement of PLA forces into Ladakh that began on 4 to 5 May took place without a nod from the Central Military Commission, the unchallenged head of which is President Tsai. Or that the move was not part of a strategy to gain territory in Ladakh so as to consolidate positions held by GHQ Rawalpindi and the PLA in the vicinity. Next year is the centenary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, and a military victory is needed to burnish the record of the CCP under its new leader. Beijing intends to take control of the entirety of the Himalayan Massif, the South China Sea and Taiwan. There needs to be a military victory as in 1962, not a stalemate as in Vietnam in 1979. The South China Seas are crawling with naval craft of multiple countries, including India, and is at present therefore a difficult location to score a swift triumph. As for Taiwan, from almost the start of her first term in office, President Tsai Ing-wen has focused on linking her country to the U.S. defense supply chain. Over the past 4 years, ties between Taipei and Washington have grown closer than at any time since President Richard M. Nixon threw Taiwan to the wolves in order to recruit Beijing in his campaign to weaken Moscow. It seems only a matter of time before Taipei enters into a formal security alliance with the US in the manner of Seoul and Tokyo. Ideally, such an alliance would be with the Quadrilateral Alliance, should that group of 4 countries graduate from a talking shop to a genuine security construct. Given the strategic essentiality of Taiwan remaining outside the grasp of China, it is certain that any attack on the island by the PLA would lead to countermoves by Japan and the US. The latter would, unless in a Biden presidency the compromat on Hunter Biden is radioactive, escalate the confrontation into other theaters, given the kinetic escalation dominance that the US armed forces enjoy over their counterpart in the PLA. Despite the chokehold that the PRC has over Russia at the present time, the Kremlin, especially under the geopolitical grandmaster Vladimir Putin, would be delighted to see the president of the US intensify moves against China. The farther apart Washington and Beijing are, the more room to breathe that Moscow has. As for India, in the absence of a clear understanding between India and the US about mutual security, the Himalayan Massif seems to be the option offering a higher chance of a PLA success in 2021 than clearing the South China Sea of foreign navies by the PLA Navy or an attempted takeover or even blockade of Taiwan. US as force multiplier. Should the Indian Army be assured of replenishment by the US of lethal armaments as well as other platforms such as fighter and transport aircraft, any move by the PLA to duplicate its 1962 ingress into Indian territory could be met by a counter-move by the armed forces of India that would push the line of actual control substantially outwards from the Indian side. This would result in a humiliation for the PLA that would have significant consequences on the prestige and credibility of the CCP, just as a kinetic setback on the boundary would have immediate consequences for the political establishment in office in India. Much of the difference between what took place in 1962 and what happened in 1971 was the result of the Indo-Soviet Treaty that was the brainchild of former ambassador to the USSR, Durga Prasad Daya. The treaty ensured the entry of the USSR into any conflict involving India and a hostile force, and this was sufficient to keep China out of the ring despite plaintive cries from both Yahya Khan and Henry Kissinger for Beijing to send in its troops now that India had committed so many of its forces to the ongoing conflict with Pakistan. For population-reducing moves such as the bombing of Cambodia and backing of the genocide in Bangladesh, Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. During the Bangladesh Liberation War undertaken jointly by the Indian Armed Forces and the Mukti Bahini, Nixon sought to tempt Chairman Mao to intervene on the side of the genocidal Pakistan army by sending in the 7th Fleet. Treaty ally of India Leonid I. Brezhnev sent in the 6th Fleet and the 7th Fleet, not liking the company, made an exit from the seas nearby the conflict. The Indo-Soviet Treaty ensured the absence of China from the 1971 conflict, just as a quadrilateral mutual security alliance would almost certainly restrain the PLA from using its new firepower on India. Given the risks to the CCP leadership in case there is a military setback, as would be the case were India to get logistical, tactical and intelligence support from other Quad members in the event of PLA aggression, it is unlikely that the Himalayan Massif will be chosen as the next theatre for Parsi expansionism were the 1971 precedent of a defensive treaty alliance to be followed by India, this time not with Moscow but with Washington and hopefully Tokyo and Canberra as well, besides in time Hanoi, Manila, Singapore, Jakarta, and Muscat. Beijing's ask to Moscow. The not insubstantial task given to Moscow by Beijing is to ensure that New Delhi does not enter into a security pact that involves the United States, whether this be a bilateral treaty or as part of a newly formalized quadrilateral alliance. In the absence of such a treaty, it would be problematic for Washington to ensure the degree of logistical support that would be needed for the Indian Armed Forces, Army, Navy and Air Force, to take the battle into the territory of the attacker and humiliate the latter. Conversely, should there be such a pact, the odds are high that the friskiness that the PLA has been showing since 2005, soon after the self-effacing Manmohan Singh was appointed Prime Minister by Congress President Sonia Gandhi, would diminish substantially. Should it not, from the viewpoint of the quadrilateral alliance, any lunge towards hostilities by the PLA would create an opportunity for a newly strengthened India to push outwards in order to gain control over the Himalayan chain and using the opportunity to clear the South China Sea of artificial islands and fortifications set up by the Parsi. Given the high probability of the resumption of 1962 scale hostilities by the PLA in 2021, it is a matter of surprise that till now, no effort seems to have been made to formalize the structure of the quadrilateral alliance into a mutual defense treaty. What is needed is for India to indicate clearly what is needed for victory in the event of an attack by China, and to work out what needs to be done to formalize a structure that assures such assistance. In 1962, India had neither a security treaty with Moscow nor with Washington. The same situation should not be allowed to prevail in the present. Thus far, Russia seems to have succeeded in its mission of keeping India from entering into a mutual security pact that involves the US. Besides helping China by such abstinence on the part of India, persuading Delhi to remain wedded to non-alignment works to the benefit of Moscow, in that a security treaty involving the US would give an advantage to that country's weapons systems over the offerings of Russia in a market crucial to the health of the armaments industry in that giant country. There are leaders who play a strong hand poorly. Vladimir Putin plays a weak hand with spectacular success. Time overdue to formalize Quad. Rather than luxuriate in visions of the dragon becoming a vegetarian from its normal existence as a carnivore, what is needed is for India to push a door that is already open. This would be the formalization of an alliance mechanism involving the Quadrilateral Alliance. This would assure the entry of other partners in any attack on a member of the Quad. What is needed is to work on what would be needed for the armed forces of the Union of India to push substantially outwards the line of actual control in the event of likely PLA aggression. Given the events of the past several years, this is no longer a case of whether but when. Hence the need to secure an alliance mechanism. In 1971 as well, skeptics within the bureaucracy and the commentariat abounded in the matter of a pact with the USSR. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi went ahead with D.P. Dal's suggestion and in the process, changed both history as well as geography. Prime Minister Narendra Modi needs to study the history of the 1962 and 1971 conflicts. Beijing and Rawalpindi look forward to a repeat of 1962. Instead, what they should be served is a repeat of 1971, this time with the line of actual control getting extended substantially across the western side, and fortified in strength on the eastern side. The Himalayan Massif is the patrimony of the Indian subcontinent, and smart policy based on reality rather than hope anchored to illusions can ensure that this come true once again.